Margaret Sullivan walked through the marble entrance of her Manhattan penthouse with her expensive shoes, making soft sounds on the polished floor. She had just returned from another successful business meeting, where she had signed deals worth millions of dollars. At 42 years old, she had built Sullivan Technologies from nothing into a company that made advanced computer systems and artificial intelligence programs. Her business was worth billions now, and she employed thousands of people across the country. But despite all her success and all her money, something felt missing in her life, though she could never quite figure out what it was. Her son Danny was supposed to be studying with his private tutor in the library room, but instead she found him standing at the huge glass windows that looked out over the city. The 9-year-old boy was pressing his hands against the glass and waving excitedly at something far below on the street. His blonde hair was messy as usual, and his school uniform shirt was untucked from his pants. Margaret set down her leather briefcase and walked over to where Danny stood. She looked down at him with a mixture of love and mild annoyance because she paid very good money for that tutor, and Danny was supposed to be learning mathematics right now. Danny turned to look at his mother with bright blue eyes full of concern. His small face was serious in a way that seemed unusual for a child his age. Margaret could see that something was bothering him deeply. Margaret asked what he was doing and why he was not in his lesson. Danny pointed down at the street 20 floors below them. He told his mother that there was a kid down there who had been sitting on the steps for many hours now. He said the kid looked alone and maybe scared. Margaret stepped closer to the window and looked down at the busy street below. Cars moved in steady streams and people walked quickly along the sidewalks going about their daily business. Among all the movement and activity, she could barely make out a small figure sitting motionless on the concrete steps of the building across the street. Even from this height, she could tell it was a young child, and the child appeared to be alone. The child was black and seemed to be wearing clothes that were dirty and worn. Margaret told Danny that the child was probably just waiting for someone to pick him up. She said it was not their concern, and reminded Danny that it was time for his piano lesson, which would start in 15 minutes. She turned away from the window and expected Danny to follow her, but he did not move. Danny said he did not think anyone was coming for the kid. He explained that he had been watching since lunchtime, and nobody had stopped to talk to the child or check on him. He said the kid just sat there looking sad and alone. Danny turned to face his mother directly and asked if they could go down to the street to check if the child was okay. Margaret was about to say no immediately. She had a conference call in 30 minutes with investors in California. She had emails to answer and reports to review. She had a fundraising dinner to attend that evening, where she would give a speech about charitable giving. She did not have time to go investigate every child sitting on a street corner in New York City. Besides, there were social services and police officers whose job it was to handle situations like this. But then she looked at her son's face and saw something there that made her pause. Danny's expression showed genuine concern for another human being. It showed compassion and empathy. Margaret suddenly realized that Danny lived in such a protected bubble of wealth and privilege that he had very little exposure to how most people in the world actually lived. Every need Danny had was met before he even asked. Every problem he encountered was solved by money or by the staff Margaret employed. Danny had never known hunger or cold or fear or uncertainty about where he would sleep at night. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She told Danny they could go down and check on the child, but only for 5 minutes. She had important work to do and could not spend all afternoon on this matter. Danny's face lit up with happiness and relief. He grabbed his mother's hand and pulled her toward the private elevator that would take them down to the street level. They rode down in silence. Margaret checked her phone and sent a quick text to her assistant saying she might be a few minutes late for the conference call. Danny bounced on his toes with nervous energy. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, Danny practically ran toward the front entrance. The doorman greeted them and held the door open with a curious expression on his face because Margaret almost never left the building on foot in the middle of the afternoon. They crossed the busy street carefully and walked toward the steps where the child sat. As they got closer, Margaret could see more details. The boy appeared to be about 7 or 8 years old with dark skin and tight curly hair. His clothes were indeed dirty and had holes in several places. His sneakers were worn through at the toes. He had a small backpack clutched tightly to his chest, and he stared straight ahead, with eyes that looked far too old and tired for such a young face. The child noticed them, approaching, and his body tensed up as if preparing to run away. But Danny walked right up to him with no fear or hesitation. Danny sat down on the step next to the boy and smiled at him in a friendly way. Danny introduced himself and asked the boy what his name was. The boy studied Danny for a long moment before answering. His voice came out hoarse and quiet when he said his name was Kevin. He did not smile back at Danny, but he did not run away either. Margaret stood a few feet away watching this interaction between her privileged son and this child who clearly came from a very different world. Danny asked Kevin if he was waiting for someone. Kevin's thin shoulders sagged and his grip on the backpack tightened even more. He said yes, he was waiting for his mother. She had told him to wait at this spot after she finished her work shift. But that had been yesterday morning and she still had not come back to get him. Margaret felt her heart drop in her chest when she heard Kevin say he had been waiting since yesterday. She asked him where he had slept the previous night. Kevin pointed with one small finger toward a narrow space between two buildings where there was a small alcove that provided some shelter from the wind. He said it was not too cold there and he had his backpack to use as a pillow. Margaret looked at this child sitting on the cold concrete steps and felt something shift inside her. She donated millions of dollars every year to various charities and foundations. She attended fancy galas where wealthy people gathered to raise money for good causes. She sat on the boards of several nonprofit organizations. But here was a child who had spent the night sleeping in an alley less than a block from her luxury penthouse, and she had not even known he existed until 15 minutes ago. Danny seemed even more distressed than his mother. He scooted closer to Kevin on the step and asked if Kevin was hungry. Kevin nodded slowly. Danny immediately turned to Margaret and asked if they could take Kevin to get some food. Before Margaret could answer, Kevin spoke up again. Kevin explained that his mother worked cleaning offices at night in the big buildings downtown. Yesterday morning before her shift ended, she had said her chest hurt really bad. Kevin had been with her because he had nowhere else to stay while she worked. Some men in uniforms came with flashing lights and put his mother on a rolling bed. They took her away in a big white truck with sirens. Kevin tried to follow, but the men told him he could not come. His mother had shouted at him to wait at their usual meeting spot, and she would come get him as soon as she could. So Kevin had been waiting ever since. Margaret pulled out her phone and asked Kevin what his mother's full name was. Kevin said her name was Linda Porter, and she was 34 years old. Margaret asked if Kevin knew which hospital the ambulance might have taken her to. Kevin shook his head. He said there were several hospitals in the area and he did not know which one. He had tried to ask people on the street, but everyone was too busy to stop and help him. Margaret made some quick phone calls while Danny stayed with Kevin on the steps. She called her assistant and explained the situation. Within minutes, her assistant was using the company's resources to check emergency room records at all the nearby hospitals. Margaret then called her personal doctor and asked for advice about what to do for a child who might be in shock or suffering from exposure after spending a night outside. While Margaret was on the phone, Danny was talking quietly with Kevin. Danny asked Kevin if he had any other family who could help. Kevin said his father had died 2 years ago in a car accident. His mother had a sister who lived in another state, but they did not talk anymore after some kind of argument. Kevin and his mother had been on their own for a long time now. Danny asked Kevin where he went to school. Kevin looked down at his worn sneakers and said he did not go to school right now. They had been moving around a lot trying to find affordable places to live. His mother kept saying they would get him enrolled once they found a permanent place to stay. In the meantime, Kevin tried to learn by going to the public library whenever it was open. He would read books and use the computers there to teach himself things. Margaret finished her phone calls and told Kevin that her assistant was working to find his mother. She suggested they go get Kevin something to eat while they waited for news. Kevin hesitated. He said he did not want to leave this spot because his mother had told him to wait here. What if she came looking for him and he was gone? Danny solved this problem by suggesting they go to a restaurant that was visible from this exact spot. Kevin could sit by the window and watch the steps the whole time. If his mother showed up, Kevin would see her immediately. Kevin thought about this and finally agreed. They walked to a small diner on the corner. The owner gave them a strange look when they entered because Margaret's clothes probably cost more than the entire month's rent for the diner, and Kevin looked like he had been living on the streets. But Margaret gave the owner a look that said she did not want any comments or questions. They sat at a booth by the window where Kevin could see the steps across the street. Kevin ordered a simple hamburger and water. When the food arrived, he ate slowly and carefully as if trying to make it last as long as possible. Danny ordered the same thing in solidarity, even though he usually preferred more expensive food. Margaret just had coffee and watched these two boys sitting across from each other. They looked so different. Danny with his clean clothes and healthy glow, and Kevin with his hollow cheeks and tired eyes. But somehow they were connecting in a way that seemed natural and easy. Margaret's phone rang. Her assistant had found Linda Porter at Metropolitan General Hospital. She had suffered a minor heart attack brought on by severe exhaustion and malnutrition. The doctors had stabilized her and she was resting, but she would need to stay in the hospital for at least 2 more days for observation and testing. Margaret asked if Linda knew where her son was. The assistant said the hospital staff had told Linda they could not locate Kevin, and Linda had become very upset and nearly had another cardiac episode. Margaret made a decision. She told Kevin they had found his mother and she was safe at the hospital. Kevin's entire body seemed to relax for the first time since they had met him. Tears formed in his eyes, but he did not let them fall. Margaret said they would take Kevin to see his mother right now. Kevin nodded and stood up from the booth so quickly he almost knocked over his water glass. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Kevin stared out the window of Margaret's luxury car and seemed overwhelmed by the soft leather seats and the smooth ride. Danny held Kevin's hand without saying anything. Margaret watched them in the rearview mirror and wondered what she was getting herself into. The hospital room was small and sterile with white walls and the constant beeping of medical equipment. Linda Porter lay in the narrow bed looking much older than her 34 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Tubes connected her to various machines, and her thin frame barely made a bump under the white hospital blanket. When Kevin walked through the door, Linda's eyes filled with tears. She tried to sit up, but the wires and tubes restricted her movement. Kevin ran to her bedside and grabbed her hand carefully, trying not to disturb any of the medical equipment. Mother and son looked at each other and did not need to say anything for several long moments. Linda finally spoke, and her voice was weak and hoarse. She asked Kevin if he was okay and where he had been. Kevin told her he had waited at their meeting spot just like she had told him to do. He said this nice lady and her son had found him and brought him here. Linda looked past Kevin to where Margaret stood near the doorway with Danny. Linda tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace of pain. She thanked Margaret for taking care of her son and said she did not know what she would have done if something had happened to Kevin while she was stuck in this hospital. She promised that as soon as the doctors released her, she would take Kevin and get out of Margaret's way. They had already imposed too much on her kindness. Margaret stepped closer to the bed and studied Linda Porter carefully. She saw a woman who had worked herself literally into a heart attack, trying to provide for her child. Margaret's assistant had done some research and found that Linda had been working 3 different jobs, trying to make enough money to afford housing. She cleaned office buildings at night, worked at a laundromat during the day, and did food delivery on weekends whenever she could get shifts. Despite all that work, she and Kevin had been evicted from their apartment 3 weeks ago when the landlord raised the rent by $200 a month. Margaret asked Linda where she and Kevin would go when she was released from the hospital. Linda's face tightened and she looked away. She said she had some money saved up and they would figure something out. She always figured something out. But her voice lacked conviction, and Margaret could tell Linda had no actual plan. Danny had been quiet this whole time, but now he spoke up. He asked his mother if Kevin and his mom could stay with them. Linda immediately said no. They could not accept charity from strangers. She had her pride, and she would take care of her son herself just like she always had. But Margaret could see the desperation in Linda's eyes even as she refused the help. Margaret sat down in the chair next to Linda's bed. She explained that she was not offering charity. She was offering a job. Margaret's penthouse was very large with more rooms than she and Danny ever used. She traveled frequently for business and was almost never home. She needed someone to manage the household, coordinate with cleaning services, handle deliveries, oversee maintenance, and help with Danny when Margaret was away. The position came with a private apartment on the lower floor of her building, full health insurance, and a salary of $90,000 per year. Linda stared at Margaret as if she had started speaking a foreign language. She said that kind of job did not exist and Margaret was just making it up to be nice. Margaret assured her the job was real, and she needed someone trustworthy and responsible. Linda had clearly proven she was both of those things by working 3 jobs and raising a child on her own under extremely difficult circumstances. Linda asked why Margaret would do this for complete strangers. Margaret glanced at Danny and Kevin standing together by the window. Danny was explaining something about the view of the city, and Kevin was listening intently. The 2 boys already seemed comfortable with each other despite having met only a few hours ago. Margaret told Linda the truth. She said her son had reminded her that people needed to help each other. Danny had seen Kevin sitting alone and had insisted they check on him. That simple act of caring had led them here. Margaret admitted she had been so focused on her business and making money that she had forgotten about the people around her who needed help. Kevin and Linda needed help right now, and Margaret was in a position to provide it. That seemed like a simple equation to her. Linda closed her eyes and a few tears escaped down her cheeks. She said she had been so scared and tired for so long. She had been terrified something would happen to her, and Kevin would end up in foster care or worse. She had pushed herself past all reasonable limits trying to keep them afloat. The idea of having stability and security seemed too good to be true. Margaret reached over and gently squeezed Linda's hand. She said Linda could start the job as soon as the doctors released her from the hospital. For the first month, the duties would be light to allow Linda time to recover her strength. Kevin could enroll in the private school where Danny attended. The school had an excellent scholarship program, and Margaret had already made some calls to arrange everything. Linda asked what would happen if it did not work out. What if Margaret decided after a few weeks that this arrangement was a mistake? Margaret said they would write up a proper employment contract with reasonable notice periods on both sides. This was a real job with real terms and conditions. Margaret ran a multi-billion-dollar company, and she knew how to handle employment matters professionally. Kevin turned away from the window and walked back to his mother's bedside. He looked at Linda with his serious eyes and told her he thought they should accept the offer. He said the nice lady seemed honest and Danny seemed like a good kid. Kevin admitted he was tired of sleeping in alleys and being hungry all the time. He wanted to go to school again and learn things. He wanted his mother to stop working so hard that she got sick. Linda looked at her son and seemed to really see how much these past months had affected him. Kevin was only 8 years old, but he had the worn expression of someone much older. He had lost his childhood to poverty and instability. Linda made her decision. She told Margaret they would accept the job offer and thanked her with a voice full of emotion. The first morning in the penthouse, Kevin woke up at 5:30 in the morning like he always did. For a confused moment, he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the clean white ceiling above him and felt the soft mattress beneath his body and remembered everything that had happened over the past few days. His mother was still in the hospital but would be released tomorrow. Kevin was staying in a small guest room near Danny's bedroom until his mother came home and they could move into their own apartment downstairs. Kevin got out of bed carefully and made it with precise corners the way his mother had taught him. He put on the clean clothes that Margaret had bought for him. They fit properly and had no holes or stains. Kevin still felt strange wearing new clothes. He walked quietly down the hallway, trying not to wake anyone else in the apartment. The kitchen was enormous with shiny appliances and marble countertops. Kevin found a glass and filled it with water from the refrigerator door. He was amazed that ice and cold water just came out automatically. At the shelter where they had stayed sometimes, you had to wait in line to get water and it was never cold. Kevin sat at the kitchen table and looked around at this place that seemed like something from a television show. Margaret came into the kitchen an hour later and seemed surprised to find Kevin, already awake and dressed. She asked if he had slept well. Kevin nodded and said the bed was very comfortable. Margaret made coffee and asked Kevin if he wanted breakfast. Kevin said he could wait until later because he did not want to be any trouble. Margaret smiled and said it was no trouble at all. She made scrambled eggs and toast for both of them. They ate together in comfortable silence. Kevin noticed that Margaret did not talk much in the morning. She seemed to be thinking about many things at once. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages and emails. Kevin wondered how anyone could run a big company and also take care of a kid and now take care of him and his mother too. It seemed like an impossible amount of responsibility. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway still in his pajamas with his hair sticking up in every direction. He grinned when he saw Kevin and asked if Kevin wanted to play video games before school started. Kevin admitted he had never really played video games before. Danny looked shocked and said that was the saddest thing he had ever heard. He grabbed Kevin's hand and pulled him toward the entertainment room. The next few hours passed in a blur of electronic noise and bright colors. Danny was patient in teaching Kevin how the game controllers worked. Kevin caught on quickly, and soon they were laughing and competing against each other. Margaret watched them from the doorway and felt something warm spread through her chest. Danny had always been a somewhat lonely child despite all his privileges. He had plenty of acquaintances at school but no real close friends. Watching him with Kevin, Margaret saw a different side of her son. Later that morning, Margaret took both boys to visit Linda in the hospital. Linda looked much better with some color back in her face. She hugged Kevin tightly and asked him dozens of questions about how he was doing. Kevin told her about the big apartment and the video games and the food. Linda listened with tears in her eyes. The doctor came in to check on Linda and said she was recovering well. She could go home tomorrow as planned, but needed to take things easy for at least a month. No heavy lifting, no stress, plenty of rest. Linda laughed and said she did not remember the last time she had taken things easy. The doctor gave her a serious look and said if she did not follow instructions, she would end up back in this hospital or worse. Margaret assured the doctor that Linda would have plenty of time to rest and recover. Her new job would not require any physical labor for the first month. The doctor seemed satisfied with this arrangement. After he left, Linda asked Margaret about the specific duties of the job. She wanted to understand exactly what would be expected of her. Margaret explained that the main responsibilities were coordinating with the cleaning service that came twice a week, managing grocery deliveries, handling any maintenance issues that came up, and being present in the apartment when Danny came home from school. Margaret traveled frequently for business and hated leaving Danny completely alone with just staff members checking in on him. Having Linda there would give Margaret peace of mind. Linda said that did not sound like $90,000 worth of work. Margaret replied that Linda's presence and reliability were worth that much to her. Besides, Linda would also be helping Kevin with his schoolwork and making sure he adjusted well to his new environment. That alone was valuable because Margaret knew she did not have enough time or knowledge to help Kevin catch up on all the education he had missed. The conversation moved to discussing Kevin's enrollment at the private school. Margaret had already arranged for Kevin to take some placement tests to determine which grade level would be appropriate for him. Despite missing months of formal schooling, Kevin was very bright and had taught himself quite a bit through library books and free online resources. Danny asked if Kevin would be in the same class as him. Margaret said probably not because Kevin was a year younger than Danny, but they would be in the same school building and could see each other during lunch and breaks. Danny seemed satisfied with this answer. Over the next few days, a routine began to develop. Kevin adjusted to living in the penthouse with surprising ease. He remained quiet and careful about not making messes or causing problems. Every morning, he made his bed with military precision. He always asked permission before using anything. He never complained about anything. Margaret found this heartbreaking because it showed how much Kevin had learned to minimize his own needs and presence. Danny, on the other hand, treated Kevin like the brother he had always wanted. He dragged Kevin into all his activities and insisted on sharing everything he owned. When Kevin was hesitant to use Danny's expensive toys and games, Danny would just hand them to Kevin and walk away until Kevin had no choice but to play with them. Margaret watched their friendship grow and realized something important. Danny was learning empathy and gratitude in a way no amount of lectures or lessons could have taught him. He was seeing firsthand what life was like for people who did not have money and privilege. He was understanding that intelligence and worth had nothing to do with bank accounts or zip codes. 6 months after Kevin and Linda moved in, Margaret was preparing to host an important dinner party at the penthouse. She was trying to secure funding for a major new initiative at Sullivan Technologies and had invited several wealthy investors to an elegant dinner where she would present her proposal. The future of the project depended on making a good impression on these powerful people. Linda had helped Margaret plan every detail of the evening. They had hired a catering company that specialized in high-end events. The penthouse had been cleaned and decorated until it looked like something from a magazine. Fresh flower arrangements sat on every table. The dining room had been set with expensive china and crystal glasses. Everything was perfect. The guest list included some of the most influential business leaders in the country. Margaret had spent weeks preparing her presentation about ethical artificial intelligence development. She needed to convince these investors that her company's approach was both profitable and socially responsible. The dinner was scheduled to start at 7 in the evening, and Margaret was nervous in a way she rarely felt. Danny and Kevin had been instructed to stay in Danny's room during the party. The boys were not happy about this restriction, but they understood that this was important for Margaret's business. Linda had prepared snacks and activities to keep them occupied. She had also made sure they finished their homework early, so there would be no arguments about responsibilities. The guests began arriving at 7 o'clock precisely. Margaret greeted each one with practiced charm and guided them to the living room where drinks were being served. The catering staff moved efficiently through the space, offering appetizers on silver trays. Conversation flowed easily as people discussed markets and investments and opportunities. Margaret felt her confidence growing as she worked the room. By 8 o'clock, everyone had arrived, and Margaret was preparing to invite the guests to move into the dining room for the main meal. The catering company had outdone themselves with the menu. The first course was being plated in the kitchen. Margaret was just about to make an announcement when a loud crash came from the direction of the kitchen, followed by a scream. Everyone froze. Margaret rushed toward the kitchen with several guests following behind her. She pushed through the door and found one of the catering staff lying on the floor. The young woman was convulsing and her eyes had rolled back in her head. Other staff members stood around looking panicked and unsure what to do. Food and broken dishes were scattered across the floor where the woman had fallen. Margaret felt her mind go blank with shock. She had no medical training and had no idea what to do in this situation. Some of the guests pulled out their phones to call for emergency services. Everyone was talking at once, and the noise level in the kitchen rose to chaos. The woman on the floor continued to convulse, and Margaret felt helpless. Then Kevin appeared in the kitchen doorway. He must have heard the commotion and come to investigate despite being told to stay in the bedroom. Kevin took one look at the situation and immediately knelt down next to the woman. He gently rolled her onto her side and supported her head with his small hands. His movements were calm and deliberate. Kevin called out in a clear voice for someone to call 911. He said to tell them a woman was having a seizure and had been seizing for approximately 30 seconds. He told everyone else to move back and give the woman space to breathe. He checked the woman's wrist and found a medical alert bracelet that said she had epilepsy. Kevin spoke to the woman in a soothing voice, even though she could not hear him. He told her she was safe and help was coming. He kept track of time on the kitchen clock and monitored her breathing. When the seizure finally stopped after about 90 seconds, Kevin carefully checked to make sure her airway was clear. He stayed by her side, keeping her in the recovery position until the paramedics arrived. The paramedics took over and loaded the woman onto a stretcher. They praised Kevin for his quick thinking and proper first aid technique. They said his actions had potentially saved the woman from choking or injuring herself further. Kevin just nodded and stepped back to let them work. After the ambulance left, the dinner party was effectively over. The guests were too shaken by the emergency to continue with business discussions. They made their excuses and left one by one. Margaret thanked them for coming and promised to reschedule the presentation. She tried to hide her disappointment at seeing months of planning fall apart. Once all the guests had gone, Margaret found Kevin in the kitchen helping Linda clean up the mess. Margaret knelt down so she was at eye level with Kevin. She told him what he did was incredibly brave and smart. She asked him how he knew what to do in that situation. Kevin's confident demeanor faded, and he suddenly looked like the frightened 8-year-old child he actually was. His hands were shaking and his eyes were wet with unshed tears. He explained that his father had suffered from epilepsy before he died. Kevin had learned all the first aid procedures in case his dad had a seizure when they were alone together. He had practiced the steps over and over so he would not panic if it happened. Kevin said seeing that woman seizing had brought back all the memories of his father. He had acted on instinct and training, but now that it was over, he felt scared. Danny appeared and put his arm around Kevin's shoulders. He told Kevin that he was the bravest person Danny had ever met. Linda gathered her son into a tight hug and told him she was proud of him, but also that it was okay to be scared. Margaret sat back and watched this family comfort each other. She thought about all the wealthy, educated adults who had been in that kitchen and how they had all frozen in panic. But this 8-year-old boy who had been homeless 6 months ago had known exactly what to do. Kevin had learned hard lessons through difficult experiences, and those lessons had given him skills and courage that money could not buy. Later that night, after Kevin had calmed down and both boys were finally asleep, Margaret sat with Linda in the kitchen drinking tea. Linda apologized for Kevin coming out during the party. Margaret waved away the apology and said Kevin had saved the evening from becoming a complete disaster. If that woman had not received proper first aid, things could have been much worse. Margaret admitted she was disappointed about losing the investment opportunity. She had worked so hard to set up that dinner and make all the right connections. Now she would have to start over. Linda listened sympathetically, but did not offer empty reassurances. She simply said that sometimes life had other plans and you had to adapt. 3 months passed and the penthouse had transformed from a cold showcase of wealth into something that felt like an actual home. Linda had been released from the hospital and had moved into the apartment on the lower floor with Kevin. She had followed doctor's orders and taken time to rest and recover. Now she was working full-time managing the household, and she did the job with efficiency and warmth. Linda had a way of making everything run smoothly without anyone noticing the effort involved. Fresh flowers appeared in vases throughout the apartment. The kitchen was always stocked with healthy food. Bills were paid on time and maintenance issues were handled before they became problems. But more importantly, Linda made sure that Margaret and Danny ate proper meals at a regular time each evening. At first, Margaret had resisted the idea of mandatory family dinners. She was used to eating at her desk while working or skipping meals entirely. But Linda had been firm about this rule. She said part of managing the household meant making sure the people in it stayed healthy and connected. So every evening at 7 o'clock, everyone gathered at the dining table for dinner. These dinners became the highlight of Margaret's day. She found herself actually looking forward to coming home instead of staying late at the office. Listening to Danny and Kevin talk about their school day was more entertaining than any business meeting. The boys had started at the private school together and were both thriving in different ways. Kevin had tested into advanced classes for mathematics and science. His teachers were amazed at how quickly he absorbed new information. Years of teaching himself through library books had given Kevin strong independent learning skills. He asked questions constantly and wanted to understand not just what things were, but why they worked the way they did. His curiosity was infectious, and even Danny started paying more attention in class. Danny's grades had improved dramatically since Kevin arrived. The two boys studied together every afternoon and turned homework into a friendly competition. Kevin would help Danny understand difficult math concepts, and Danny would help Kevin with writing assignments. They pushed each other to do better while also supporting each other through challenges. One evening at dinner, Linda served a pot roast with vegetables that smelled amazing. As they ate, Danny told a story about something that had happened at school that day. A new student had joined their grade, and some of the other kids were making fun of him. Because his clothes were old and he did not have the latest phone or gadgets, Danny said he remembered when he used to not understand why those things did not matter. But now he got it. He had invited the new kid to sit with him and Kevin at lunch. Danny explained that Kevin had taught him that being kind was more important than being cool. Margaret felt her eyes get misty listening to her son talk about empathy and friendship. Kevin added that the new kid was actually really smart and knew a lot about astronomy. Kevin said they had spent lunch talking about planets and stars, and it was one of the best conversations he had ever had. Linda reached over and squeezed her son's hand with pride evident on her face. Margaret shared some news from her company. Sullivan Technologies was working on a new artificial intelligence system that could help identify students who were at risk of falling behind in school. The system would analyze various data points and alert teachers early so they could provide extra support before the student failed. Margaret said the project had been inspired by Kevin's story, and she wanted to help prevent other kids from slipping through the cracks, the way Kevin almost had. Linda asked thoughtful questions about how the system would protect student privacy and ensure it did not unfairly target certain groups. Margaret was impressed by Linda's understanding of complex ethical issues. They had a long discussion about the responsibility that came with creating powerful technology. Kevin and Danny listened carefully and occasionally added their own thoughts. After dinner, the boys went to do homework while Margaret helped Linda clean up the kitchen. Linda said she had been thinking about something and wanted to discuss it with Margaret. She explained that she was grateful beyond words for everything Margaret had done for her and Kevin. Their lives had completely changed in just 3 months. But Linda was worried about becoming too dependent on Margaret's generosity. She wanted to make sure she was truly earning her salary and not just accepting charity disguised as employment. Margaret put down the dish she was drying and looked at Linda directly. She said Linda had brought something to this household that money could never buy. Before Linda and Kevin arrived, the penthouse was just an expensive place where Margaret and Danny existed separately. Now it was a home where a family lived together. Margaret admitted she had not realized how lonely and empty her life had been until Linda and Kevin filled those empty spaces. Linda smiled, but still looked uncertain. Margaret continued and said that beyond the emotional value, Linda was doing exactly what Margaret needed. The household ran smoothly. Danny was happy and thriving, and Margaret could travel for business without constant worry. Those things were absolutely worth the salary being paid. Margaret added that she hoped Linda would stop thinking of this arrangement as charity and start thinking of it as a mutually beneficial relationship between people who cared about each other. Linda nodded slowly and seemed to accept this explanation. She changed the subject and asked Margaret about an upcoming business trip to California. Margaret said she would be gone for 4 days meeting with potential investors. She felt comfortable leaving Danny with Linda now, whereas before she would have hired a nanny or taken Danny with her and disrupted his school schedule. The weeks continued to pass with a comfortable rhythm. Margaret found herself working fewer hours and spending more time at home. She discovered that she actually enjoyed having dinner conversations and hearing about everyone's day. She started attending Kevin's basketball games at school where he had joined the team. She went to Danny's piano recitals and helped both boys with their science fair projects. One Saturday morning, Margaret woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. She put on her robe and walked out to find Linda teaching both boys how to make pancakes from scratch. There was flour everywhere, and the kitchen was a mess, but all 3 of them were smiling and joking. Danny flipped a pancake and it landed on the floor. Everyone burst out laughing. Kevin tried next and managed to flip his pancake successfully. They all cheered. Margaret stood in the doorway watching this scene and felt something she had not felt in years. Complete contentment. Her phone buzzed with an email from a business partner asking about a meeting on Monday. Margaret looked at the email, then looked back at her makeshift family covered in flour, and decided the email could wait. She walked into the kitchen and asked if she could help make pancakes too. The next morning, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from one of the investors who had attended the disastrous dinner party. Charles Hammond was the chief executive of a major technology company and had been considering putting significant money into Margaret's artificial intelligence project. Margaret assumed he was calling to politely decline the investment after the chaos of the previous evening. Instead, Charles said he had been thinking all night about what he witnessed. He told Margaret he had been in countless high-pressure situations during his long career in business. He had seen executives handle crises and make decisions under stress, but he had never seen anyone respond as calmly and effectively as that young boy in the kitchen. Charles asked Margaret to tell him more about Kevin. Margaret explained Kevin's background and how he came to be living in her home. She told Charles about finding Kevin alone on the street and learning about his mother's heart attack. She described how Kevin had taught himself coding and advanced mathematics using free resources at the public library. She talked about Kevin's intelligence and kindness and remarkable resilience. Charles was quiet for a long moment after Margaret finished speaking. Then he said he had been looking for a way to make his charitable foundation more effective. The foundation gave out scholarships to deserving students, but Charles felt they were being reactive instead of proactive. They waited for exceptional students to apply rather than seeking out children who needed help before they fell through the cracks. Charles proposed a partnership between his company and Sullivan Technologies. Together, they would create a program to identify and support gifted children from difficult circumstances. The program would not just provide scholarships for school. It would offer comprehensive support, including housing assistance for families, counseling services, mentorship programs, and career development. Charles said he wanted Kevin to be the first student in this program, and he wanted Margaret to help him design the initiative. Margaret was stunned. She had expected to lose an investor, and instead she had gained a partner for something much bigger than her original project. She told Charles she would be honored to work with him on this program. Charles said he would have his lawyers draw up the partnership agreements, and they could announce the initiative within a month. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Charles worked intensely on developing what they called the Opportunity Initiative. They hired education experts and social workers to help design the program structure. They established criteria for identifying students who would benefit most from comprehensive support. They created mentorship networks connecting successful professionals with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Margaret insisted that Kevin and Linda be involved in the planning process. Kevin had lived experience that the experts and executives lacked. He understood what it felt like to be invisible and struggling. Kevin attended planning meetings and offered suggestions about what kind of support would have helped him most. Some of his ideas were simple but profound. He suggested that the program should include help with basic things like getting a library card, accessing public transportation, and finding safe places to study. Linda contributed insights about the challenges facing parents who were working multiple jobs and barely surviving. She explained how difficult it was to help your child with homework when you were exhausted and stressed. She talked about the shame and isolation that came with poverty and how that affected both parents and children. Her perspective helped the team design family support services that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Danny became an unofficial ambassador for the program among his classmates at school. He talked about how smart Kevin was and how everyone deserved chances to learn and grow regardless of their family's bank account. Some of the other wealthy students started asking their parents to donate to the Opportunity Initiative. Danny's enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. The program launched with a press conference that attracted significant media attention. Margaret and Charles stood at a podium and explained their vision for identifying and supporting talented young people before they gave up on education. They talked about the waste of human potential that occurred when bright children were denied opportunities due to circumstances beyond their control. They announced initial funding that would help 50 students in the first year. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Several other companies reached out asking how they could support the initiative. Wealthy individuals offered to sponsor students or provide mentorship. Schools and community organizations volunteered to help identify children who would benefit from the program. The response exceeded Margaret's most optimistic projections, but along with the praise came some criticism. A journalist writing a detailed article about the Opportunity Initiative discovered Kevin's connection to Margaret. The journalist wanted to make Kevin the human interest story at the center of the piece. Margaret was hesitant about putting Kevin in the spotlight, but Kevin surprised her by saying he wanted to participate. Kevin explained that he wanted other kids who were struggling to see that things could get better. He said if telling his story helped even one other child receive support, then it was worth the discomfort of public attention. Linda was worried about protecting her son's privacy, but ultimately agreed to let Kevin make his own choice. The resulting article was powerful and moving. It featured photographs of Kevin and Danny together, clearly showing their close friendship. The journalist captured Kevin's intelligence and determination in her writing. She quoted Linda talking about how close they had come to losing everything. She described Margaret's decision to help a stranger and how that decision had rippled outward to create something that would help thousands of children. The article included a quote from Danny that became famous overnight. The journalist had asked Danny what it was like having Kevin in his life. Danny had looked at the journalist with confusion and said simply that Kevin was his brother. When the journalist pointed out they were not actually related, Danny replied that being brothers had nothing to do with biology. He said Kevin was his brother because they cared about each other and supported each other. He asked why that was hard for people to understand. The quote spread rapidly across social media. People shared it with comments about how children understood things that adults had forgotten. News programs picked up the story and showed clips of Danny and Kevin together. The phrase, "he is my brother," became a rallying cry for the Opportunity Initiative and for broader conversations about family and community and mutual responsibility. But the attention also brought unwanted scrutiny. Some people criticized Margaret online, saying she was using Kevin for publicity, to make herself look good. Others questioned whether it was appropriate for a wealthy white woman to be involved in raising a black child. Still others suggested that Margaret was trying to buy redemption for the sins of capitalism by helping one child while running a corporation that contributed to inequality. Margaret sat in her office late one evening scrolling through social media comments about the Opportunity Initiative and feeling overwhelmed by the mixture of praise and criticism. Some people called her a hero while others called her a hypocrite. Some praised the program while others picked apart every detail looking for flaws. The constant judgment from strangers was exhausting. Linda found Margaret sitting in the dark, staring at her computer screen. Linda walked over and closed the laptop firmly. She told Margaret to stop reading comments from people who did not know her or understand the situation. Linda said those internet voices did not matter because they were not part of the real family that existed in this home. Linda reminded Margaret that Kevin was thriving in ways that would have been impossible 6 months ago. He was attending an excellent school and making friends. He was pursuing his passion for mathematics and science without worrying about where his next meal would come from. He was laughing and playing like a normal child instead of carrying the weight of adult responsibilities. Those results spoke louder than any online criticism. Linda also pointed out that the Opportunity Initiative was already helping other families avoid the desperation Linda had experienced. 50 children were receiving comprehensive support that addressed both their educational needs and their family stability. That impact was real and measurable regardless of what internet strangers thought about Margaret's motivations. Margaret knew Linda was right, but she still felt defensive and hurt by the attacks on her character. She had genuinely been trying to help, and it stung to have her motives questioned. Linda sat down next to Margaret and spoke more softly. She said Margaret needed to let go of needing everyone to approve of her choices. Some people would always find reasons to criticize, especially when someone with privilege tried to use that privilege to help others. The criticism said more about their own discomfort than about Margaret's actual actions. The conversation helped Margaret gain perspective. She realized she had been so focused on public perception that she had lost sight of what actually mattered. The real story was not playing out on social media. It was happening at the dinner table every evening, where two boys who came from different worlds had become genuine brothers. It was happening in the Opportunity Initiative offices, where social workers and educators were matching children with resources. It was happening in families across the city, where parents no longer had to choose between paying rent and feeding their children. 2 years passed, and the changes became even more evident. Kevin was now 10 years old and had skipped ahead another grade due to his exceptional performance in school. He was taking high school-level mathematics courses and had developed a particular interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning. His teachers said he had an intuitive understanding of complex algorithms that was rare even among much older students. Danny was 11 and had grown into a thoughtful young man with strong values around social justice and equality. He volunteered with the Opportunity Initiative, helping to mentor younger students. He had started a club at school focused on community service and had recruited many of his wealthy classmates to participate. Danny's experience with Kevin had fundamentally shaped his worldview and his sense of responsibility to others. The Opportunity Initiative had expanded beyond anyone's initial projections. The program now served over 300 families across multiple cities. Other corporations had joined as sponsors, and the model was being studied by education policymakers around the country. The success rate was remarkable, with 90% of program participants showing significant improvement in academic performance and family stability. Kevin had become something of a symbol for the program, though. Margaret and Linda tried to protect him from too much attention. Occasionally, Kevin would speak at fundraising events or participate in promotional materials, but most of the time he was just a normal kid going to school and playing with his brother. One spring afternoon, Margaret received an invitation for Kevin to present a project at a national science fair. Kevin had developed a software algorithm that could analyze patterns in student data to identify children who were at risk of falling behind before they actually failed. The algorithm looked at factors like attendance, homework completion, test scores, and even less obvious indicators like changes in behavior or social interaction. Early intervention based on these patterns could prevent students from giving up on education entirely. The project was sophisticated and impressive, but what moved Margaret was Kevin's explanation of his motivation. In his application essay, Kevin wrote that he had developed the algorithm because he understood what it felt like to be invisible. He explained that when you were poor and struggling, it sometimes felt like nobody noticed you or cared if you disappeared. But everyone had value and potential. The algorithm was designed to make sure no child became invisible, the way Kevin had almost become invisible. Kevin won first place at the science fair. The victory came with scholarship offers from prestigious universities and attention from technology companies interested in his algorithm. But Kevin's response to all the attention was characteristically humble. He said he had just tried to solve a problem he understood personally. He gave credit to his mother for teaching him to care about others, and to Margaret for giving him the resources and stability to pursue his education. The award ceremony was held in a large convention center. Margaret sat in the audience next to Linda and Danny watching Kevin accept his trophy. She thought about the day Danny had looked out the window and noticed a child sitting alone on the steps below. That simple moment of awareness had set everything else in motion. If Danny had not insisted they go check on Kevin, none of this would have happened. The Opportunity Initiative would not exist. Kevin might not have survived. After the ceremony, they went out to celebrate at Kevin's favorite restaurant. As they ate and talked and laughed together, Margaret looked around the table at this family they had built. Linda had become not just an employee but a true friend and partner in raising both boys. Danny and Kevin were inseparable and balanced each other perfectly. They challenged each other academically while supporting each other emotionally. They came from completely different backgrounds, but they had formed a bond that was as strong as any biological relationship. Danny raised his glass of soda and proposed a toast. He said he wanted to toast to his brother Kevin for being the smartest and bravest person he knew. Kevin rolled his eyes but smiled. Then Kevin raised his own glass and toasted to his brother Danny for seeing him when everyone else walked past. He thanked Danny for insisting they help him that first day even though they were strangers. Linda added her own toast, thanking Margaret for taking a chance on a desperate woman and her child. She said the past 2 years had been the most stable and happy period of her entire life. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. She raised her glass and said she was the one who should be thankful. Before Linda and Kevin came into their lives, Margaret and Danny had been isolated and disconnected despite all their wealth. Now they had something money could never buy, which was a real family built on mutual love and respect. The waiter came to take their dessert order, and the moment passed. But Margaret held on to the feeling of completeness and contentment. She thought about all the criticism and questions they had faced over the past 2 years. People had asked if it was appropriate for them to be raising Kevin. They had questioned the family structure and made assumptions about everyone's motivations. But those critics did not see what happened behind closed doors. They did not see Kevin helping Danny with homework, or Danny teaching Kevin about basketball. They did not see Linda and Margaret talking late at night about parenting challenges and laughing about the boys' latest antics. The truth was simple, even if the world wanted to make it complicated. They were a family because they chose to be. They supported each other through difficulties and celebrated each other's successes. They ate dinner together every night and talked about their days. They cared about each other's happiness and well-being. That was what family meant, regardless of race or class or biology. On the drive home that evening, Kevin fell asleep in the back seat with his trophy clutched to his chest. Danny sat next to him, scrolling through congratulations messages on his phone from friends who had seen news coverage of the science fair. Linda sat in the front passenger seat making plans for the week ahead. Margaret drove and felt a deep sense of peace. She thought about the Margaret who had existed 2 years ago. That woman had been successful by every conventional measure. She had money and power and respect in her industry, but she had been lonely and disconnected from what really mattered in life. She had been so focused on building her company that she had forgotten to build relationships. Meeting Kevin and Linda had changed everything. It had reminded Margaret that business success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. It had shown her that the most important investments were not financial, but personal. The Opportunity Initiative would continue to grow and help more families. Kevin would continue to develop his talents and likely go on to do remarkable things. Danny would carry the lessons of empathy and service with him.